George Whitefield was an 18th century ordained minister for the Church of England and one of the leading figures of the Great Awakening. According to many historians, and one in particular, Null, George Whitefield was the best known evangelist in the 18th century and one of the greatest itinerant preachers. According to my study, I will try to show the great impact that George Whitefield has had on the American evangelical scene down to the present day. I will explain the open-air preaching method, which we call today, and I will explain the appeal that George Whitefield had to the common, ordinary citizen. George Whitefield, in his endeavor to preach the gospel, invented the open-air preaching method. He did this because he had such a zeal to get the gospel out and to reach as many people as possible. His acquaintance with the Wesley brothers and George Whitefield actually introducing the Wesley brothers to this new open-air preaching method paid great dividends, not only in America but in evangelical Christian community worldwide. And I will show you the lasting influence that this particular method that George Whitefield employed in England had in America, and the clear preaching that George Whitefield employed and how he reached the ordinary citizens with that. According to theologian R.G. Tuttle in L. Wells' Dictionary of Theology, George Whitefield was a founding member of the Holy Club, which was created and convened at Oxford College in England. George Whitefield was one of the founding members, along with Charles Wesley, and when his older brother, the more famous John Wesley, who is credited for the founding of the Methodist Church, came back to Oxford, that's when John Wesley met George Whitefield and became fast friends really till the day they died. And the influence that John Wesley had from George Whitefield and the dividends, like I said, that paid to the American religious world. George Whitefield's first trip to America was in 1738 to Georgia, where he helped to organize a orphanage. At that point, since he didn't necessarily have a church to preach in, he started doing the same thing he was doing in England, and he would go outside and preach to large crowds of people, and the people really responded to that. His clear preaching really appealed to the ordinary citizen, and he had great success in this new method of preaching outside to a numerous amount of people. He returned to America in 1740 and to the New England area, and at that point historians have documented that George Whitefield actually preached to at least 8,000 people a day for over 30 days in the New England area during this time period. And that's what most historians have credited the start of the Great Awakening, was through the influence of George Whitefield, his open-air preaching method, and how it reached so many people, and the response that he got from citizens. And this not only helped propel the gospel to many people and sparked this great spiritual awakening in the Great Awakening, but it also broke down many denominational differences that existed between the Baptists, the Presbyterians, and brought people together, really for the first time. The influence that George Whitefield has had through his open-air preaching method has been emulated down through the centuries by people like Billy Graham and the modern-day evangelists. We take it for granted of these methods, but it really started with George Whitefield. Just to close this lecture, I would just like to say that the influence that George Whitefield has had on the lives of the ordinary citizen through this preaching method and through his great preaching will probably never be fully realized until the other side of eternity. And just in closing, I'd like to say that a good article on George Whitefield and on the Great Awakening can be found in this book, the Oxford Companion to Christian Thought, which has an excellent, thorough article on George Whitefield. Thank you for listening, and thank you. Good night.